There's a quiet moment that happens in almost every man's life. A moment when a young boy is told, "Don't cry, be a man." Maybe it happens on a school ground, maybe in a locker room, maybe at home with family sitting around. It's subtle. It doesn't make headlines, but it stays. Years later, that same boy might still carry the echo of those words inside him, like an invisible rule book for how he's supposed to live. It's one of the earliest lessons society teaches boys about what it means to be a man. But here's the question. What if the very idea of strength that's passed down is not strength at all? What if it's just a myth, one that's been disguised as truth for generations? Tonight, we're pulling that mask off. We're diving into the difference between toxic masculinity and real strength. And trust me, it's not what you think. I want you to imagine a boy named Daniel. He grew up in a small town, the kind of place where people measured a man's worth by how hard he could punch, not how deeply he could feel. He loved drawing. He loved music. But every time he picked up a pencil instead of a football, someone laughed. So Daniel learned how to hide the soft parts of himself. He toughened his face to stay still when he was hurt. He trained his voice to toughen. He learned to perform strength, not live it. And here's the thing. Daniel isn't alone. His story mirrors millions. For centuries, cultures around the world have built images of masculinity that were less about humanity and more about control. Ancient societies often defined strength through physical dominance: warriors, hunters, conquerors. In ancient Sparta, for example, young boys were taken from their families and trained in brutal conditions to suppress emotions and become perfect soldiers. Crying was weakness. Empathy was useless. Softness was dangerous. Over time, this narrow definition of strength became tradition, and tradition slowly turned into identity. But science has a way of peeling back myths. Modern research in psychology and neuroscience tells us something revolutionary. Emotional intelligence, empathy, and vulnerability are not weaknesses, they're superpowers. Studies from Harvard and Stanford have shown that men who are emotionally expressive and self-aware actually handle stress better, build stronger relationships, and are more resilient in the face of challenges. Real strength isn't about suppressing emotion, it's about mastering it. Still, the world around us keeps sending mixed signals. Think about the movies we grew up watching. The action hero who never flinches, never cries, never apologizes. The strong, silent type. He's the one who saves the day. He's the one boys want to be. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That image, over time, builds cages. It builds men who are afraid to admit pain. Men who were taught that the only acceptable emotion is anger. That's toxic masculinity. Not men themselves, but the cultural mold that tells them they have to act like something they're not. Daniel grew older. He got stronger. Muscles, jawline, confidence. From the outside, he looked like the perfect example of what society calls a real man. But inside, he was exhausted. He didn't know how to talk about anxiety. He didn't know how to cry when his father died. He didn't know how to say, "I love you," to the people he cared about. So he buried it all. And when you bury emotions long enough, they don't disappear. They find a way to come out, often through anger, frustration, or silence that grows louder than any scream. If we look back at history, these patterns are everywhere. During the Industrial Revolution, men were expected to work grueling hours in factories, keep their heads down, and provide. Feelings had no place in a world that equated masculinity with labor and endurance. Later, during world wars, soldiers were praised for suppressing fear. Returning home, many were broken inside, but were told to man up. No therapy, no language to explain trauma, just silence wrapped in a masculine mask. Science today paints a very different picture. The human brain, regardless of gender, is wired for emotional connection. Suppressing feelings doesn't make you strong. It increases stress hormones like cortisol, leading to anxiety, depression, and even physical illness. Studies from the American Psychological Association reveal that men are less likely to seek help for mental health issues, not because they don't feel pain, but because they've been taught not to admit it. That silence costs lives. Globally, suicide rates are disproportionately higher among men. And so many of those lives could have been saved if we had simply redefined strength. But here's where the story shifts. Real strength doesn't look like the action hero who never cries. It looks like the father who tells his son it's okay to be scared. It looks like the friend who admits when he's struggling. It looks like Daniel, sitting in his car one night, realizing for the first time that strength isn't about wearing armor, it's about daring to take it off. There's a study conducted by Dr. Brené Brown, a research professor at the University of Houston, that found vulnerability to be one of the strongest indicators of courage. Men who opened up emotionally were not weaker, they were braver. They took risks that required more strength than lifting weights or winning fights. They showed up as themselves. Throughout history, we've celebrated warriors, kings, and conquerors. But the strongest men were never the loudest. They were the ones who carried kindness into cruel worlds. Think of Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. They didn't rule through violence. Their strength came from moral clarity, emotional resilience, and the ability to inspire. Real strength is quiet. It doesn't scream, it stands. Toxic masculinity tries to convince men they must dominate to prove worth. Real strength reminds them that true power is in self-control, empathy, and respect. Toxic masculinity builds walls. Real strength builds bridges. Daniel's story doesn't end in silence. He found therapy. He started talking. And at first, it was terrifying. But slowly he discovered that he wasn't alone. Men around him began opening up too. One conversation became two became a group became a community. And that's the thing about myths. Once you start talking about them, they start to crack. This isn't about blaming men, it's about freeing them. Toxic masculinity isn't a villain wearing a mask, it's a system of old, outdated beliefs. But systems can change. They change when one man chooses to say, I don't have to pretend anymore. They change when strength is no longer measured by how much pain you can hide, but how much truth you can hold. Biology plays a role too. Men have higher levels of testosterone, which can increase competitiveness and risk-taking. But science also shows that testosterone is not a violence hormone. It can amplify whatever social behavior is rewarded in a culture. If a society rewards aggression, testosterone fuels that. If a society rewards cooperation and empathy, testosterone fuels that too. Which means masculinity itself isn't toxic. The cultural script around it is. When we teach boys that they can cry, love, create, and express, we don't make them weaker. We make them whole. And when men are whole, communities are stronger, families are closer, and societies are healthier. So let's go back to Daniel. A few years after that night in the car, he stood at his friend's wedding giving a speech. His voice shook a little, not because he was scared of looking weak, but because he wasn't hiding anymore. And as he spoke, the people in the room saw something real. They didn't see an unbreakable mask, they saw a strong, human man. And maybe, somewhere in that room, there was a young boy who grew up hearing, "Don't cry." But in that moment, he saw someone who did, and lived, and thrived. And maybe, just maybe, a myth broke for him too. This is the heart of the conversation we need to have. Not about tearing men down, but about letting them breathe. Real strength is not the absence of fear, It's the courage to face it. Real strength is not about control. It's about connection. Real strength isn't toxic. It's healing. The next time someone tells you, be a man, remember, being a man isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about being human. And humanity is the strongest thing we have. This is where the story lands, not in shouting matches or blame, but in quiet revolutions, in everyday choices, in men like Daniel, in fathers teaching their sons, and in friends who listen. Myths are powerful, but truth is stronger. And if you've watched this far, maybe you felt something. Maybe you remembered a moment in your life when you had to hide a part of yourself. Maybe you've been Daniel, or maybe you know one. This conversation isn't just for men, it's for everyone.